Hi there. If you're watching this on YouTube, or you're wanting to watch any of my content on my channel, or both for that matter, I would strongly recommend hitting the subscribe button and comment and like on any videos if you may wish, because this is a general audience channel. Also, this video is not made for kids, it is for older fans and adults alike. So please sit back and enjoy the video.
And now, our feature presentation.
Mid Sodor Engines Part 1. Albert. Based on the original story by Ryanhealy and Douglasroberts, adapted, edited, and told by julyleonard. Dear friends, the Mid Sodor Railway has a rich history, which, in favor of more recent adventures, has been largely overlooked. Duke has a wealth of stories about engines, events, and people who have graced the line over the years, some of which have happy endings, others without such. Here are four of the stories he recanted recently for the benefit of Mike, the small railway engine, which left him with a deeper appreciation of the trackbed he runs on. The authors. Story 1. Albert. Sir Handel, who had his bolt on the top of his cab mended, felt none the worse of his adventure, but felt content about being back at work again. A few nights later, he and Scarloey were resting in the sheds when Geoff, the works diesel, pushed a flat truck with a small red tender engine into the sidings adjacent to their line. Sir Handel was startled by the engine's size, and looked on in disbelief. "My word!" he exclaimed. "Surely he can't be a proper steam engine. He's far too small." The engine scowled at him. "You watch your mouth," he warned. "I'm one of the strongest engine on my line." "You?" snorted Sir Handel. "Surely not." "I am, and you're lucky I'm not on that wharf because I'd—" all right, that's quite enough, you two," Scarloey chuckled, trying to restore order to the situation before Duke arrived back. "Remember when Kuldee came and enlightened us about mountain railways? This is similar to that, Sir Handel. I recall hearing of a small railway on the island, you know." Duke backed into the shed and recognized the little engine immediately. "I say, that's one of the little engines who helped the fat and thin clergyman to rescue me years ago," he smiled fondly. "Scarloey and Sir Handel, this is Mike." "Oh, yes," said Mike. "I recall now. You're Duke." "They built a new line over our old one years ago, Sir Handel," Duke explained. "That's where Mike and his friends live and work." "Your line was long gone before ours came along, though. We run from the port of Arlesburg, next to Duck's branch line, the Little Western, and into the hills, like you used to live, past Farquhar roads and by the Green. We were brought in to bring in away the mine spoils to use as weed killer ballast on the railways." "If only we'd known that at the time. Such a shame, really. But I'm happy here all the same, reunited with my old shedmates, Sir Handel and Peter Sam." Scarloey was growing curious about the old line. "Were there more of you on the old Mid Sodor, Duke?" he asked. "Oh yes, Scarloey," Duke recalled fondly. "There were a fair number of engines running throughout the lifespan of the Mid Sodor.
but not all of them remained. Toward the end, there were 10 of us in service. Tim, Jerry, Atlas, who worked in the mines, Jennings, John, Bertram, my brother, who was nicknamed the Old Warrior, Freddie, also known as Fearless Freddie, Falcon, Stuart, and myself. 4 other engines had to be disciplined and put in their places, whilst one was sold off, and you actually replaced one of them in the early days, Sir Handel. The other acquisition from the Falcon Works in Loughborough in the mainland, and the original MSR number 3 before you came along. Albert.
Was this Albert as bad as him? Quizzed Mike, referring to Sir Handel, who shot him a dirty look in return. That's enough of your lip, snapped Sir Handel firmly. He knew all about his predecessor's behavior. His driver on the Mid Sodor had worked with Albert beforehand. Driver never spoke well of Albert. Whatever happened to him anyway?
He learned his lesson the hard way,
said Duke, rolling his eyes and sighing deeply as he began to recall the unfortunate tale of Albert's downfall. Albert was primarily a goods engine with a fearsome reputation on the Mid Sodor and a tendency to be very difficult. His crew often felt the brunt of his temper, and he used to bully them relentlessly.
Remember to clean it out properly this time, he barked one night in the sheds. I've been choked full of soot and ash all day thanks to your negligence.
Duke didn't take kindly to Albert's attitude, and was one of the few engines on the line who would stand up to him.
You really have no respect for your crew whatsoever, do you? Who would? Albert grimaced. When they can't clean your tubes out properly at the end of a day's work, what respect are they due? Engines should work with their crews, said Duke firmly, not against them. Your poor attitude will come back and haunt you one day. Mark my words. I know better. Always have done. And if they don't like it, that they can lump it.
Duke said no more. Albert was never one to listen to reason, and remained steadfast in his belief that he knew better than anyone else, and that included the manager. But there did come a day when Albert would find his ways weren't always the best. It was his last run of the day, and as usual, he was in a hurry to get back to the sheds. He bustled about the quarry, shunting the trucks fiercely and bumping them forcefully around the yard, much to the annoyance of the foreman. "Be careful, you silly engine! Bump 'em like that, and they are liable to break." But Albert took no notice of him. "They're dispensable, horrible, rickety old things, not worth the materials they're built with." "Well, so long as they carry the materials to the port, then I don't care what you make of them," he retorted. "Now less of this nonsense and behave yourself." Albert continued to marshal the trucks around the yard, and without much further mishap, he brought them to the junction to wait for Duke to pass by with the picnic. Albert felt crosser still at having to wait. "He's taking liberties again. He's late." "Calm down," said his driver. "He's probably been held up with some sheep or something." But Albert just scoffed. "I should take priority to myself and run on anyway. Knowing him, we'd probably clear the section before he's even got this far." Eventually, Duke showed up and hurried through, trying to make up for lost time, and soon after, Albert was allowed to start off again. He hurried along the line, intent upon getting back to the yards for what he believed to be a well-earned rest. But his hopes for a clear run-through were dashed when his crew began to slow him down at the next station. "What's going on? Why are we stopping?" "Your tanks are running low," said the fireman. "We need more water to keep going." "Never mind the water. We wasted enough time already thanks to Duke, so we'll carry on regardless." The driver and fireman tried to reason with him, but Albert refused to listen. At the next station, they tried to brake, but Albert deliberately used the weight of the trucks to keep on rolling and overshot the water tower. They tried in vain to go back, but the weight of the trucks and Albert's lack of cooperation didn't make for easy work. "It's no good," said the driver at last. "We'll have to try further down." This was the opportunity the trucks had been waiting for. They were tired of being bumped and banged by Albert, and decided now that was the time to pay him out. Meanwhile, Duke had arrived safely at the port and made up sufficient time. Albert shouldn't have been too far behind with his goods, but tonight there was no sign of him. Duke was anxious.
For all his faults, he's very punctual. I wonder what's wrong.
They soon found out. Albert's fireman came plodding down the line with urgent news for the station master. Albert's overheated. He wouldn't stop for more waters at the workstation, so we carry on regardless. And now he's stuck at about a mile or so up the line with a dry throat. We'll need Duke to help shift him. Without delay, Duke hurried off up the line to the point where Albert was standing. In the meantime, the driver had thrown the fire out and was now doing all he could to cool him down. When Duke arrived, Albert was in a loss of words.
I think it might have been better to listen to your crew for once. Just wait until manager finds out. He won't be pleased. It was the wretched trucks, Albert wheezed pathetically. They held back and made things worse than they should have been. We could have managed.
You would have managed with more water in the tanks, said the fireman firmly. Then we wouldn't have struggled when the trucks began to play up. The driver could only agree with them. I can only hope you've learned your lesson after this. But the lesson had come too late for Albert. That evening, the manager strolled up to him and spoke to him severely. You always were a troublesome sort of engine, said the manager firmly. And the damage you've caused to yourself won't be easy to repair either. The inspector says your firebox crown has melted as a result of your foolishness.
I apologize, sir, said Albert meekly. I promise it won't happen again.
Indeed, it will not, for we will not be mending you. At least this way, other engines on this railway will learn that a little respect goes a long way. You shall be taken apart and used for spares for the others. Good day to you. Albert was put to the back of the shed and taken to bits overtime. Duke and the others often felt guilty about accepting his spares, but they knew that the manager was right in his decision.
It's a pity,
Duke often thought when he recalled Albert.
He did learn his lesson. Just a shame that it was too late.
Mid Sodor Engines Part 2. Stanley. Based on the original story by Ryanhealy and Douglasroberts. Adapted, edited, and told by julyleonard. The following morning, Mike was conversing with the engines again and asking Duke more questions about the Mid Sodor Railway, much to the annoyance of Sir Handel particularly. Nosy little tyke, he muttered under his breath. There's nothing wrong with him knowing about your old lines, Sir Handel, said Scarloy. I think you are just sore after last night. It was an affront the way I was spoken to, fumed Sir Handel. His arrogance reminds me of Stanley. Who's Stanley? Asked Mike, glaring at Duke in hope of an answer. He was an arrogant little... But before Sir Handel could finish, Duke interjected with a confession.
There's more to the Stanley story than you may think, Sir Handel.
This was quite a surprise to both Sir Handel and Peter Sam. For years, they believed they knew all there was to know about Stanley and his infamous downfall.
I will admit, Stanley was a bit of a handful at times, but the manager taking away his wheels and such wasn't entirely his fault.
And this was the story Duke had told them. The manager had ordered a new engine from the American War Department in order to help keep the main line running and replace a previous number 2 engine named Smudger, one of the 2 acquisitions from Fletcher Jennings & Co., alongside Jennings, who was a show-off by rough riding after he was turned into a generator at the back of the shed, but he was having doubts over his own decision. I haven't heard great things about these engines, the manager told Duke a few days prior to Stanley's arrival. I fear this may not be the bargain buy the board think it will be.
I understand completely, sir,
said Duke gravely, and prepared for the worst. And he was right to do so. When the engine arrived, Duke found him very difficult to deal with. He was brash, cocky, and above all else, completely sure of himself. You needn't to tell me how to run this line, he drawled to Duke. I ran through trenches and over bad track. I steamed through mud, rain, and snow without a hitch. Now then, where's them darn trucks at?
You just better be careful, young'un, Duke told him firmly. You're not in a war zone now, so there's no need to be boisterous.
But Stanley took no notice and puffed away up the line with an inane, broad grin across his smokebox.
He won't last long with that attitude, Duke thought to himself. I could feel it in my frames.
His driver was skeptical of the new acquisition as well. I know his type. They were built on the cheap for the American War Department to run on shoddily laid track in trenches and battlefields, brought over from America by the score for use as disposables. They're certainly not built to last by any stretch of the imagination, and railways, like ours, will have to bear the brunt of them now the war's over. Duke was quick to agree.
Cheaply built, cheap quality, and cheaply scrapped if he doesn't mind himself.
And the suspicions of the old engine and his driver were right. By early afternoon, Stanley had come a cropper, and the manager was flustered when he arrived to see Duke. That dratted new engine has gone and derailed completely, he told Duke. We'll need a breakdown gang down the line on the double. Stanley was easily derailed and hauled back to the shed, where Duke spoke to him severely about his actions.
This won't do, young Stanley. You will be on the passenger duties by my side, and we must keep the trains running efficiently. Mishaps like that would not suit his grace at all.
But Stanley took no interest whatsoever. Listen, buddy, I'll do things my way. In the day, if we derailed only once a trip, it was an achievement. Duke groaned and said no more. He knew trying to get through to Stanley would be an uphill battle. A few weeks later, Duke was due to take Stanley on the mountain road on a double-headed picnic train. As they prepared, Duke went through the motions of the operation with Stanley.
Manager won't trust you unless you can show you're mature enough to work passenger runs alone. Go slowly, pay attention, and keep your eyes on the road.
Oh, give it a rest, you old grouch, scolded Stanley. I am mature enough. While you were pottering about your sedentary little mining line, I was tearing through the war-torn battlefields of the continent. This shouldn't be a problem. Stop fussing so much. Duke seethed with rage at Stanley's lamentable ignorance. However, he did calm down somewhat throughout the course of the run. But his good mood was soon cut short after they left the workstation. With a loud clang and screech of metals, the train ground to a halt. Duke looked on in disbelief.
I don't believe it!
Stanley stood tilted to the left side, derailed again. Darn tracks! They aren't fit for a wagon to roll on.
Somehow, I managed to keep balance and composure.
Yeah, well, you did push me, buddy. This is your fault. Now get me back on now.
I most certainly did.
Now, Duke, said his driver, let's not waste time arguing with him. We'll need to re-rail him and get moving again. I'll go and speak to the workmen. Fortunately, Stanley wasn't too far gone, so the workmen had little trouble in jacking him up and allowing Duke to haul him back onto the rails again, with little thanks for his efforts. Gee, finally! Come on, don't hold back, Gramps. Y'all make us late. Duke was livid. But despite the difficulties, they finished the run in good time, and the manager greeted them at the top station when they arrived. While Stanley was shunted out of the way briefly, he spoke warmly to Duke. You did very well there, Duke. That wretched engine could have seriously jeopardized today's service, but you did well to save the day. Well done. But he wasn't so jovial with Stanley, however, and following the mishap on the mountain road, he was left at the back of the shed in disgrace. When he finally did re-emerge, he was to be relegated onto goods work. He cannot be trusted with passenger workings, the manager told his crew. He's far too rough and reckless. Hopefully this ought to do him some good. You'd best be careful, Yonin, Duke advised. I feel this may be your last warning. Stanley wasn't convinced and dismissed Duke's comments. He was happy the way he was and didn't care what anyone else thought. But despite the change of duties, the problems persisted with constant spillages and frequent mishaps, which quite often meant derailment. The manager had put him on a service called the horse and cart, named so because it covered the entire line at a very slow pace. The manager's thinking behind this was that Stanley wouldn't have to rush and therefore reduce the likelihood of derailment. But it didn't work out quite as he had hoped. Stanley continued to rush, and over a course of time, he became cockier still. Slow down, Stanley, called his driver one day as they bumped and bounced down the valley. There is no rush. We need to take these bends with ease. Too much delayed shunting in stations, Stanley persisted. We're making up time. There's plenty of time left, so slow down. But Stanley paid no attention and continued rattling down the line. But trouble lay right around the next bend. A flock of sheep had broken out of a field and were now blocking the line ahead. The driver fought for control, but the speed of the train and the weight of the trucks made things especially difficult. He braked hard, a little too hard by all accounts, and Stanley left the rails, landing inches from the sheep with a loud crack. Ow, 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 he wailed feebly. Dang it, I feel broken all over. The driver examined him while the guard went to get help from further down the line. When he returned with Duke and the breakdown gang, they learned that the damage was worse than they had previously anticipated. Stanley's valve gear was badly damaged, and his wheels were further apart than they should have been. He had torn his frames apart. All that rocking and reeling, the driver gripped bitterly. It's no wonder he fell apart. Probably the shoddiest piece of engineering I've ever had the displeasure to come across.
We all tried to help you see reason, Stanley, said Duke firmly, with a twinge of sympathy, looking at Stanley, lying forlorn and slumped. But you wouldn't listen, and now look where it's left you. Manager won't be pleased when he finds out.
And indeed, he wasn't. When Duke got him back to the works, he was waiting for them. Now, what to do with you? he murmured, examining Stanley's shattered parts. Despite Stanley's incident, his cockiness had failed to subside. Nothing that won't fix, eh, sir? And gave a nervous laugh. I'm afraid your recklessness has caused damage we can ill afford to repair, Stanley, the manager told him gravely. But rest assured, we still have a place for you here, and I intend to make you useful. The manager was as good as his word. The following day, Stanley was separated from his wheels and cab, and within days joined Smudger at the back of the shed, but as a pumping engine. We always needed better ventilation for the shed, said the manager proudly, and now we won't have the problem of you derailing any longer, either. Soon afterwards, he was replaced by an engine named Andreas, a Hunslet War Department acquisition, as number 2, who was arrogant and considered himself to be an express engine. Because of his high speed, leading him to derail, in turn, he was turned into a steam launch at the port of Arlersburg. In the years to come, Duke would use Stanley's downfall as an example to other young and unruly engines, as Sir Handel and Peter Sam knew all too well. But while he was glad, however, that Stanley was spared from a worse fate, he still knew he deserved the punishment he received. But more importantly, deep down, Stanley knew this too. Mid Sodor Engines Part 3, Jimthejinx. Based on the original story by Ryanhealy and Douglasroberts, adapted, edited, and told by julyleonard. That manager of yours, said Mike, sounds like a horrid man. Sending all those engines off for scrap like that? What a waste! Duke chuckled. He had fond memories of the old manager of the Mid Sodor Railway, and was quick to defend him.
I know I've painted him out in an unfavorable light, but he was a kind man who stood no nonsense from his engines, particularly those who reoffended. Smudger, Stanley, Andreas, and Albert didn't deserve to be saved. They showed no remorse or guilt. But one engine we all recall was saved.
Peter Sam knew who exactly Duke meant. Peter Sam knew exactly who Duke meant. You mean Jimthejinx, don't you, Grandpa?
Ah, yes. Poor old Jim was always falling foul of something. A sensible and kindly young engine, but plagued with bad luck. Whoever would have thought one of his own misadventures would have been what had saved him?
Poor Jim never saw trouble, but it seemed to follow him wherever he went, and at times would be several strides ahead waiting for him. One morning, there was a terrible noise screaming towards the workstation. Jim puffed in with his whistle jammed, blowing loud and relentless.
Stop it!
cried Jim, sobbing in a state of panic. "Please, someone stop it!" The engines looked on in horror as a workman leapt across the platform, brandishing a hammer, and slammed it into Jim's whistle, finally silencing it and breaking it at the same time. "Thank goodness for that," the manager sighed. "What on earth happened, Jim?"
"We blew the whistle to try and shift some sheep out of the way, and a pin fell out of my whistle."
"Everything seems to happen to you, doesn't it, Jim?"
"I'm truly sorry, sir."
"Oh, don't worry, Jim. It wasn't your fault. It could happen to any engine. We'll get you a new whistle in due course. But in the meantime, I'm afraid you'll be out of service for a while until I can make other arrangements." That night in the shed, Jim was anxious. Duke and Stuart were sympathetic and tried to cheer him up, but Falcon, on the other hand, was being rather rude. "It's not your fault, isn't it? You're just jinxed," he teased. "Jim the Jinx. That's what you'll be known as from now on."
"That's enough, Falcon," burst out Duke. "At least he's not reckless enough to blindly career off the side. Jim here is just plain unfortunate."
"Maybe Falcon's right," put in Tim, who was one of the more pragmatic and pessimistic engines on the line. "Jim is prone to mishap, you know." "He's jinxed," Falcon muttered under his breath.
"It could happen to any engine, Jim," Duke said softly. "Don't listen to him."
"Yes, but it always happens to me, though, Duke," groaned Jim. "It's so unfair."
Jim went unhappily to sleep. He couldn't help these unfortunate happenings and hoped desperately that the manager would realize that too. The next morning, as there were no spare whistles on site, other arrangements were put in place for Jim. For the time being, he was to shunt trucks in the quarries. The trucks knew all about Jim's jinx and were keen to take advantage.
"Oh, look,"
they giggled in their silly way.
"It's Jim the Jinx. Send for one of the others. Anything can happen when he's about. We want Duke or Stuart."
Jim was standing no nonsense and decided to be firmer with them.
"That's quite enough," he told them resolutely. "I'll stand no more of your nonsense."
"Be careful, Jim," warned his driver. "This is exactly the sort of thing that can lead to accidents." But the trucks just kept on with their teasing, until at last Jim lost patience. When shunting them into place, he bumped them hard. Too hard. They flew forward and hurtled toward the buffers, smashing through and hitting the rock face with an ear-shattering crash.
"Oops,"
said Jim meekly. The foreman was very cross. "You silly engine," he scolded. "Now we'll be delayed. Wait until manager hears about this." As soon as Jim had a new whistle fitted, the manager put him on to goods work in hopes that nothing else would go wrong. And for a while, it didn't. But he still had shadows of doubt about Jim and the Jinx that plagued him so. Hence why, when a consignment of gunpowder arrived on the railway, and Jim was the only engine available, he was reluctant to send him.
"I don't like it. What if something goes wrong?"
"We haven't even had a minor mishap for months," soothed his driver. "You'll be fine. So long as we're careful and safe, nothing will go wrong."
"I hope you're right,"
puffed Jim thoughtfully. Jim puffed evenly and smoothly up the valley with his dangerous train. Everything was going well until he rounded another bend.
"Oh, drat!" he groaned. "It's those rotten sheep again. Whatever will we do?"
"We'll have to blow the whistle and startle them," advised the driver.
"But what if we ignite the gunpowder?"
"Blow loudly, Jim. It's the only way we'll get them off the line." He grabbed hold of Jim's whistle chain and gave it a great tug. He blew it long and loud, and it echoed over the fields and down the valley. "It's working! They're scattering! Well done, Jim!" The gunpowder was still safe and secure, and Jim sailed on through to the quarry to a chorus of cheers from the waiting workmen.
"Perhaps I've beaten the Jinx once and for all,"
he thought cheerfully. But come winter, he would find that the Jinx hadn't subsided. it had just lain dormant. Duke was quick to warn the others of a ledge on the section that Jim worked, which could prove hazardous throughout the winter months. Stuart reiterated the importance of care on this section to Jim, who promised to take extra care. But the snowy weather worsened as the day wore on. Jim tried to give as much care and attention to his train as he could as they weaved their way down the line.
"Can't afford to slip. Can't afford to slip," he puffed as he edged his way along. But the trucks had other ideas. "We'll give 'em the slip," they whispered to each other. "That'll teach 'em to mistreat us."
As the driver began to ease the brakes on, they surged forward into him.
On, they cried, and sent Jim skidding down the line.
Jim's driver slammed his brakes on. At first, they were able to control the trucks, but as the track curved downwards, the force of the trucks gained momentum.
"Not now!" exclaimed the driver.
"Hold on, Jim!" Jim held on for dear life, but the icy rails kept him skidding along toward the tunnel mouth and the sharp bend. Jim was in a state of pure panic and despair.
"I can't hold them! My brakes have shattered!"
With a horrifying shatter of wood and steel, Jim and his trucks flew off the sharp corner and hurtled into the valley below. His crew had jumped clear before the crash and ran to get help. Stuart and Falcon were in the yard when the manager came rushing across with the urgent and unfortunate news. "Jim's gone and thrown himself off the ledge. You'll need to take a maintenance crew and help him." When they arrived, the two engines could scarcely believe the damage that Jim had incurred, but remained hopeful that their friend would be okay. Work took a long time, and the engines spent the rest of the day in the freezing cold whilst Jim was repatriated and eventually hauled home, battered and broken by a traction engine. When they arrived back at the yard, the engines were ordered to move Jim into the workshops. Much to their surprise, the manager was cheerfully discussing plans with the foreman. "Yes, we could do it with his cab removed. Might be a better proposition, actually." Stuart was anxious.
"I wonder what's going to happen to him."
"We can only wait and see,"
Duke said nobly. But even he feared the worst for the proper unfortunate Jim. Weeks passed, and nothing more was heard or said of Jim. But one morning, the engines received a very nice surprise standing as bold as brass in the workstation yard.
"Good glory!" whistled Falcon. "It's Jim!" "They've repaired me as good as new," smiled Jim. "I've never felt better."
"Perhaps he wasn't jinxed after all," chuckled Tim, admiring the work done on the newly overhauled Jim.
"Took away his cab, though. Now he's like Atlas the mine engine,"
chuckled Duke.
"So, Jim, what's the manager got planned for you?"
"A boat trip to the mainland," said the manager. "That's the plan." "The boat, sir?" exclaimed the engines in unison. "Yes. You see, Jim's accident was a blessing in disguise. He was just unlucky, and our narrowing twisting line and his weak brakes didn't suit one another. However, we have found him a new home in the mainland, where I'm sure Jim will flourish."
"But, sir," said Stuart, "he's got no cab like Atlas."
The manager laughed and explained. "He won't need one. He'll be working on a sand quarries railway, flat, sandy, and good for fast running. Therefore, I wager there will be no more dangerous hazards to get in his way. And thanks to the money we've made through Jim's sale, we can finally make much needed improvements here. So everyone wins."
"I feel much better already," puffed Jim cheerfully. "Thank you for everything. It's been wonderful working with you all."
Jim was pushed into a low wagon, and the traction engine trundled off down the road track, to the chorus of the engines whistling until they were fit to burst. And although Jim never did return to the Mid Sodor Railway, the engines had it on good authority that he was doing well in his new home, and the last they heard, he was the quarry's favorite engine. So I think it'd be safe to say that Jim wasn't a jinx anymore. Mid Sodor Engines Part 4 Closure. Based on the original story by Ryanhealy and Douglasroberts, adapted, edited, and told by julyleonard. The workmen had given Mike his final inspection, and plans had been put in place for him to return home that evening. This gave Sir Handel no end of relief. Good riddance to that nosy little mite, he grimaced.
Oh, I don't know, Sir Handel,
said Duke.
I found Mike's presence and inquisitive nature to be rather enjoyable.
Mike was soon pushed back into the siding again by Geoff the Worksteasel, looking very pleased. I'll be back later to take you home, Mike. He wants you to stay a little longer while talking with all of you, he said. I can imagine he would, grumbled Sir Handel.
He's more than welcome, Geoff,
Duke smiled graciously.
But I expect you'll be keen to return home again, though, Mike.
Yes, it'll be nice to get home. But can I ask before I go, why did your line close down?
There were lots of reasons. The main one being that it wasn't useful anymore. Toward the end, no one needed us in the valley. A few years after Jim went, other engines were sold on, leaving Falcon, Stewart, and I to run the line. But even before then, times were hard.
And this was the story Duke told them. There was a great deal of change taking place over a period of years preceding the closure. The major catalyst of the decline came in the form of the new power station built just beyond the railway's terminus. The railway was deemed too small to be of any great use to them, and so the Fat Controllers Railway, the NWR, built a new branch to serve it instead. Duke felt rather sore about this. He felt the railway's contributions to the valley were being overlooked entirely, and that the engines were being relegated into second place.
It would never suit His Grace to see this. I can remember a time when we meant something to this valley,
said Duke grimly. Falcon kept a more philosophical view of the proceedings. We're too small, Grandpuff. We couldn't manage those loads on our line. The new branch line was essential. Stewart tried to lighten the mood with his optimistic view of the situation. Don't worry. We'll manage regardless. The holiday makers and picnickers will still use us, won't they, Grandpuff?
Of course they will,
Duke agreed.
And the locals still love our railway. They won't let us down.
The engines agreed to carry on regardless, maintaining faith that their little railway would endure the difficult times that loomed over them. But still the difficulties came one by one, and Duke felt the indignity more so than any of the others. The boat, which came from the Isle of Man, had for many years been a reliable and stable form of income for the railway, bringing visitors to the Mid Sodor Railway in the summer months for special excursions. It came as rather a shock to Duke when he discovered that it would no longer be calling at the port of Arlesburg.
But why?
He pleaded with the station master.
The tourists thoroughly enjoy a trip on our line.
I'm sorry, but they don't think we're profitable anymore, so they've discontinued the boat services. We'll just need to do without it, I'm afraid, Duke. And so, for the duration of the season, they did. That year, passenger numbers for the special trains for the summer season were modest at best. However, they were the only thing keeping the mountain road alive, and after the tourist season ended, trains on the section ran near empty. And so, in good faith, the manager decided it was time to close this section.
I understand your feelings entirely, sir, but the passengers love the mountain road,
said Duke, rather concerned. We can't run a section that's only viable for part of the year, he explained gravely. It's a luxury we can ill afford to accommodate. It's simply not useful enough anymore, Duke. Deep down, Duke knew the manager was right, and vowed to keep going for the sake of the mines and passengers in the valley that still depended upon and appreciated their efforts. The icy grip of winter came soon, and with it, further depreciation. Goods trains became emptier, and even the horse and cart was scheduled less and less. But no matter what, Duke continued to keep the faith and encourage the others to do the same.
"There's already been one mine closed already," said Duke mournfully one morning. "Driver says there's less and less slate to gather."
Falcon still maintained hope, but he was still rather unsure of it all.
There are other mines, and the villagers still travel with us. We're in the throes of winter,
Duke told them firmly.
When the better weather comes back, so will the holiday makers. Until then, we must manage as best as we can.
Falcon glanced over to Duke then. "Surely we wouldn't close down?" Duke grimaced.
"Not in our time,"
he murmured sternly. Sure enough, the bitter winter passed, and spring soon began to bloom, bringing its promises of renewal and warmth to the valley and the railway. However, these were false promises, as the engines discovered when the management took further steps to keep their heads above water. All 10 remaining engines were gathered at the sheds, where a large group of men were waiting for them. Tim, Jerry, Atlas, the mine engine, John, Jennings, Bertram, and Freddie were seemingly singled out for attention by the group and were being inspected from top to bottom by some smartly dressed gentlemen and scruffier men in overalls. "Oh, I don't like this at all," Tim whimpered pathetically. "What if we're closing down? I couldn't bear the thought—" "Be quiet," scolded Atlas. He rolled his eyes and groaned. "He's been like this all the way down here." Stewart, Falcon, and Duke could sympathize with him. They had been speculating why this meeting had been called to order to begin with, but the reasons were apparent for all to see. By the end of the day, the 6 other engines had been sold and arrangements were put into place for them to be moved off site. It was a sorrowful day for all. Even Falcon was sad about the departure of his old friend Fearless Freddie, as he promised that they'll treasure the good times they had. Bertram, another one of the 7 departed engines, and Duke had to part because Bertram was needed at one of the mines to keep it running, much to Duke's depression. From there on, the decline worsened still. Track repairs were at best rough, and at worst, simply left unattended. There were a number of occasions in where trucks derailed on their way down to the port, and time was lost re-railing them in the middle of the train. Very soon, even the best of the coaching stock was sold on. Falcon took umbrage at having to work without his smart express coaches. "The indignity of all! Imagine having to pull these wretched four-wheelers instead of my smart bogey coaches," he complained.
"We all have to make sacrifice, Yunnin,"
Duke firmly reminded him.
"The special picnic coaches are currently under tarpaulins in the shed as well. Manager's doing all he can to keep things viable, and as long as we keep steaming and stay reliable, we should be able to weather the bad times."
"Surely," puffed Stewart optimistically, "we'll see developments and an improvement. Surely we won't close down for good?" "Not in our time," the 3 engines said in unison. And so this became their motto, which they would continue to place faith in. Up and down the valley, they would pull their little trains of 4-wheel coaches or slate wagons dutifully in a great effort to keep the line running. Not long after, the mines were expanded and pushed to their utmost limits for the war effort. They hadn't shifted so much lead for years, but Duke and the others knew that there would be consequences if they did exhaust the mine. In the end, Stanley was moved there to work as a pumping engine at the mines, much to Smudger's delight, given that they'd been constantly beefing each other about who should have been a better suitable MSR number 2. He had suffered poor maintenance over the years, and Falcon was skeptical over whether or not he'd be of much more use.
I can manage,
He wheezed hoarsely as he was shunted into place. I can only hope others share your optimism, Falcon sighed, unconvinced. When the war finally ended, great hopes surrounded the line. The engines believed the passengers and holidaymakers would abandon the buses and flock back to the railway, and the goods traffic would thrive all the while. However, this wasn't to be the case. The buses were providing a much more viable service, and the manager knew the railway couldn't compete. The passenger service was ultimately discontinued, and Duke's heart sank. Now they truly had been relegated into second best. We shall be carrying on as a mineral tramway, the manager explained, but even he knew this wasn't going to be a long-term solution. Many of the mines had already closed, and several more were due to follow shortly after, until all that remained was the one Stanley was pumping out. Rains ran as and when required, and the sound of an engine's whistle became more and more of a rarity in the valley. Then one miserable winter morning, Duke arrived at the mine to find a crowd of miners standing at its entrance with somber faces full of despair.
What happened?
Duke asked the miners.
Why aren't my trucks ready?
The pumping engine broke down, and the mine has been flooded beyond rescue, the mine manager told them. Duke hissed with fury and rage.
So that's it! Curse you, Stanley! You've managed to bring the whole railway down as I once said you might! You blasted cheap pile of scrap!
The time had come. With no further reason to exist, the railway closed. Stations were stripped down, rolling stock was sold or scrapped on site, and the shed was decrepitating. The engines were to put up for sale. Duke stood alone in a siding whilst the bidders clamored around the other two engines. The manager approached him and his crew shortly afterward with grave news. They've decided they're taking Stewart and Falcon to work on the aluminum works project, but unfortunately, Duke never made a sale. The driver and fireman were sad. They knew what this could mean. What do you propose then, sir? You can't just scrap him, surely. After so many years of faithful and reliable service, I wouldn't dream of it. There's still hope for Duke. Clean, grease, and sheet him. He can stay in the shed. I'm confident he'll find a buyer at some point.
Thank you, sir,
smiled Duke bravely.
We'll keep the faith.
Whistles of encouragement came from the two younger engines as they left the yard for the last time. They knew this would be the last time they would all be together on their own little railway of the Mid Sodor. Duke was oiled and greased one last time and then tucked away quietly. The shed doors closed and the curtain had finally fallen on the Mid Sodor Railway's working life. Mike was touched by this story and couldn't help but feel sorry for Duke and the others. But Skarloey and Duke knew that more importantly, the closure of the Mid Sodor had brought about prosperity to their new home and saved Skarloey Rheneas's life.
Our line's loss has been a massive gain to our new home. They were right. There was still hope, and they did come back for me. The memory was kept alive, and over time, the seeds were sown, culminating in an expedition led by the thin and small controllers with the help of two clergymen, one fat and one thin. One of whom quite serendipitously found me when he fell through the roof.
All too soon, Geoff arrived to shunt Mike into place on Douglas's goods train. Let's get the wee beastie back to his lair, chuckled Douglas.
He's not at all bad, Douglas, laughed Duke. We have enjoyed having him amongst us to recount tales of our old line too.
Aye, I remember it well when you came out of yon shed. Now the spirit of the wee old line'll live on mare. Now the wee engines know, Douglas replied as he puffed away with Mike on his flat truck. Duke and the others sincerely hoped that would be the case.